Hi, everyone. So this video is about how to be free from guilt and shame and other similar kinds of emotions and mental states forever, which is really possible. Now, the great tantric master Abhinavagupta said 1,000 years ago, the cause of all forms of psychological suffering or mind-created suffering is a lack of understanding of the nature of reality. So the remedy is understanding of the nature of reality. And when that understanding is sufficiently complete, it eliminates all forms of mind-created suffering, which it turns out is the great majority of the suffering that most of us experience. So that's quite a profound change in one's life. And so this video addresses one specific aspect of that, right? For many people, shame and guilt and the belief I should have done differently, I made a terrible mistake that is the cause of this or that bad situation, and I should have done differently. I should have known better. And people torture themselves with the idea that they could have done something differently and should have done something differently. And this is a very strange thing, really. Of course, we're the only animal in the entire animal kingdom, or the only creature on planet Earth that voluntarily engages in self-torture. And this is one of our primary forms of self-torture that I could have and should have done differently. And we call it guilt, shame, or whatever other words that we apply to it, okay? So the understanding I'm going to outline here, hopefully, if I do a good job, will free you from that forever, free you from a big chunk of psychological suffering. And I do believe it's possible to be free of all psychological suffering, all mind-created suffering permanently. We call that state liberation. We meaning those who study and practice in Indic spiritual traditions, the traditions of South Asia. Okay, so here's how it works. There are many things that appear to be so that are not actually so, right? So this is sometimes called in tantric philosophy the tyranny of ordinary appearances. And the practice of tantra was characterized by the great Lama Yeshe as overthrowing the tyranny of ordinary appearances, getting at the reality of things instead of how we think things are on the basis of our conditioning, our mental filters, our projections, and so on. Okay, so an easy, simple example is, well, here you are on a gigantic globe spinning at, a considerable speed, but you don't feel that, right? It looks to you as if you're on a stable surface, a static ground, and that the sun is traveling across the sky, and then the moon throughout the day and the night. It very much looks that way. And anyone who learns enough maths and the principles of observational science can verify that that's not what's really happening, that in fact you are on this big globe, which is spinning rapidly and revolving around the sun. Okay, so that is verifiable with just, undergraduate level maths and science training. And so, okay, so we can accept that things might be very different from how they appear, even in fundamental ways. And so a corollary of what I just described in terms of our inner life is this feeling that I am choosing whatever, right? And that there are no constraints on my choice. Now, sometimes we don't feel that. Sometimes we actually do feel constraints, right? We feel something influencing us to choose one way or the other. But by and large, we imagine ourselves as this kind of free agent who can just choose to do whatever it likes in any given moment, right? And the reason we can imagine that, the reason that that appearance is there, which is like the appearance of the earth not moving and the sun traveling across the sky, is because most of the influences on our choices and actions are not visible to us, in the same way that, you know, the structure of the solar system is not actually visible to us. It can only be inferred through close observation and calculation. Okay, so what are those constraints, you know, and how does choice actually happen? This is a really interesting thing to contemplate, because if it's not actually true that we're choosing unconstrainedly, then we might be interested in what those constraints are. And so this is what science, of course, has given us. And you'll see how I link it to tantric philosophy in a little while. But basically, science describes a causal matrix, right? Where there are countless causes that are interacting in highly complex ways. So when it comes to a human being, then of course we have to look at things like, you know, neurobiology, right? Neurochemicals, the neuroendocrine system. We have to look at hormones, you know, because when a person is making a decision, right, the hormones in their system influence that decision one way or another. For example, stress hormones, right? Adrenaline, right? This whether adrenaline is present in your system or not influences your decision. It even influences how attractive you find someone in front of you. Famous study that, you know, I don't know if it was done for both, for more than one gender, but in the study, men found women more attractive when their adrenaline was heightened due to crossing an unstable bridge. Okay, so they didn't know that adrenaline was affecting the degree to which they found the opposite sex attractive, but it did, and it was documentable and has been documented, and the study is sound. So that's just one of many examples, right? Okay, so many physical factors might be playing a role that you may or may not be conscious of, like simple ones like, are you hungry or not? Are you in some degree of pain or not? Are you smelling a bad smell or not? There's another somewhat famous study in which it was shown that people are more likely to answer pessimistically and conservatively on a quiz about social and political issues if they were smelling a horrible smell while filling out the quiz. But this is not the sort of confounding factor that most people are aware of as a confounding factor, meaning the subjects of the study did not realize, and indeed didn't believe, that the smell would influence significantly what they put down as their opinion on social and political issues. And yet it does, as was shown repeatedly. So that's just, I'm just throwing out examples here to show that there's all these confounding factors and influences that you are aware of and aren't aware of as well. And then that we're not even getting into, right, the influence of your genes, the fact that somebody with certain genes is more likely to choose X over Y, and somebody with different genes is more likely to choose Y over X, right? That's all true, of course. And it's not just about genes, it's about gene expression, meaning to say how genes interact with environment, which determines which genes turn on and which genes turn off. All of that influences your choices, okay? So there's all these influences. Now, here I'm alluding to the work of Robert Sapolsky, the great biologist, who shows, you know, that not only are all these influences present, they add up to 100%, meaning to say a decision gets made when the influences on your thought and action combine to make it appear as if there's one preferable thing to choose, if you see what I mean. So in other words, when the influences on our thought and action don't combine to narrow things down to one obvious choice, then we feel ambiguous. The feeling of ambiguity, I'm not sure, maybe this, maybe that, is exactly the state of having those various influences on thought and action not sum to a single conclusion, but to several possibilities. And indeed, a decision gets made exactly when they sum to 100%, meaning to say the options narrow down to one due to the combination of all these factors. Because no single one of them, usually, no single one of them can really be called a cause, right? Because they're all influential. Each of these factors, and again, we're talking about neurochemical, we're talking about hormonal, we're talking about physical, we're talking about emotional, we're talking about, of course, things like how much trauma has there been in your life in the last year, or 10 years or whatever. What was your fetal life like? What was your birth like? Everything, right? It all combines. But each one of these is just influential. It's not causal. Do you see what I mean? It makes it more likely that you'll choose this versus that. Okay. And they all play a role in all your significant decisions. And they all play, well, not all, many of them play a role in all your insignificant decisions as well. So when these different factors, which make this or that more likely, meaning to say they make X or Y or Z appear as the more obvious choice, right? And they make it more likely that it would appear as such, but they have to come together to cause an actual determination where you say, yes, okay, X is my choice or Y is my choice. Okay. So, some people say, okay, so this sounds like determinism, which is sort of a philosophical position. Well, yes and no, right? This is the notion that that the causal matrix is highly complex and that everything sums together to produce the actual output, the decision that is produced, but it's not determinism. It's not determinism in the sense of predeterminism, meaning to say you're not some puppet having its strings pulled by the forces of fate or the gods or something beyond your control or hyper intelligent pan-dimensional beings. No, none of that, right? So in that sense, it's not at all determinism because there is no external force, right, that is determining the outcome. It's actually everything. This is where it now then comes back to tantric philosophy, because you might say, oh, this guy talks about science a lot, and if I want to learn science, I want to go to a scientist, and if I want to learn tantric philosophy, I want to go to a tantric philosopher. And this guy has a PhD in tantric philosophy, so why can't he just stay in his lane? Because I'm interested in truth. And if you're really interested in truth, you have to look at it from more than one angle. Okay. This is not just about, staying in one's particular niche specialist subject. Then you can only say the truth about that subject. But if you're interested in the truth of reality, which a practitioner is, and okay, so some academic scholars would say that's exactly where Dr. Wallace's, flaw lies. He's a practitioner. That is to say, a good scholar, being not a practitioner, will just be interested in, his or her particular subject. And a practitioner is interested in this thing called truth with a capital T. Okay, fine. Everyone can think what they like. This is just, I can't help what I'm interested in, and neither can you. I'm interested in truth, both of my academic subject and of the nature of reality. So for that, how could I or anyone neglect the findings of neuroscience or any other findings that bear on the study of how consciousness creates the reality that experience, or constructs it, if you prefer? and all the other subjects, right, that tantric philosophy covers that overlaps with modern science, which are a lot. Okay, anyway, the point is, in fact, this modern scientific view that I've been outlining, referring to Sapolsky's work and that of others, is found in the tantric tradition, in the doctrine summed up as sarvam sarvatmakam. Everything is contained within everything else. And indeed, the cause of anything that happens is literally everything else that has ever happened. Okay, let the implications of that sink in. If you don't understand how this is literally true, you might watch Sapolsky's deservedly famous TED Talk. It's only 15 minutes long, where he shows this principle. He's never heard of tantric philosophy, as far as I know, but he shows the principle of sarvam sarvatmakam. The cause of everything that happens is everything else that has ever happened. Going back even ultimately, yes, to the beginning of time, but certainly going back to the beginning of time on planet Earth. Okay, so when we say that the cause of anything that happens is everything else that has ever happened, right, that we're referring to an extremely complex causal matrix in which any one thing changes and the outcomes can be different, right? And of course, physicists debate about how to interpret the fact that the universe in which we live seems as if fine-tuned for life, right? Meaning if any of the forces, particularly some subtle forces like the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force, if they were different by just 1/100th of 1%. That's not an exact figure, right? In fact, for one of those forces, it's even less. But if they were different by even something like 100th of 1%, there wouldn't be life in this universe. How do we explain that? And then people invoke the anthropic principle and so on. But the point is, right, that in fact everything is very delicately calibrated and such that there aren't one-to-one causes. It's not true that A causes B, which causes C. Now, when we tell that simplistic story, then we can blame ourselves for all sorts of things, but it's just not true. And we're representing ourselves as a character in a drama mentally, and then believing our own representation. So it's another example of something that tantric philosophy criticizes quite a lot, which is believing in our own stories as a cause of psychological suffering and as a way in which we simply deviate from the truth of existence. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention, the other sort of way this is taught in tantric philosophy is that there is one agent of all actions, right? Is a kind of teaching it is a teaching that you get in tantric philosophy, that there is only one agent of all actions, right? And we call that agent Shiva. Now, agent means one who performs an action. So you could say there's only one actor, there's only one performer of all actions, but the technical term in philosophy, both Eastern and Western, is agent. There's only one agent of all action is simply a way of saying that there aren't independent agents who are somehow acting outside of the causal matrix, okay? So in other words, you might be saying by now, oh, is this an argument against free will? No, the phrase free will is the problem there. Okay, the misunderstandings all center on the meaning of that phrase or what people assume it to mean. What we're actually saying here is that there's no independent will, meaning that this idea that people have, especially Westerners, that you're somehow a ghost in the machine, right? That everything is determined except you somehow, right? That you can independently instigate an act of will, that you can independently choose without being constrained by the causal matrix that constrains literally everything else. That is crazy and incredibly, incredibly hubristic. Okay. You want sources? There are many. The Ishvara Pratibhignakarika's of Utpaladeva teaches there's only one agent of all actions, and that is Shiva, or we call that one Shiva. And the Spandakarikas also say nobody acts by independently instigating, an act of will. There is no such independence possible, except the independence of the whole. Right? It is said, now this is a kind of theological assertion, that the one infinite divine consciousness freely and independently manifests a universe of experience for itself. It freely and independently manifests, this world as its sort of playground and as its stage for both tragedy and comedy and everything else, right? So, do you see? Whether or not you agree with that proposition, it's just a way of answering the question. Oh, wait a second. I thought, in this tradition, it said consciousness is absolutely free and independent. Yes, absolutely. Consciousness, which is one, which is singular, which freely manifests itself as the entire pattern. And your sense that you're a separate consciousness, separate from that whole pattern, a ghost in the machine, right? Or a bug in the matrix, or whatever you want to consider yourself, that sense is false. That sense is manufactured and reinforced by nothing but thought. Okay. So therefore, yes, free independence, swatantriya in Sanskrit, but that doesn't pertain to the individual, because there is no individual. There's no such thing as individuality, right? Because, do you see, in the same way that a tree is formed out of its environment, right? A tree is literally nothing but a particular concatenation of earth and water and sunlight. That it's a way the environment on this planet expresses itself, and so are you. The combination of factors is more complex. There's more things getting involved, right, to create you, right? The basis of life is the same, but it's you're a more complex biological entity than a tree. But you're not different from a tree in the sense that your environment creates this body mind, right? Now, of course, in Tantra, we don't say that it creates consciousness. The environment creates this body mind through which consciousness is looking, that consciousness in this plane of existence needs a body mind vehicle, or uses a body mind vehicle to look through, right? As it were. One shouldn't take these sort of metaphysical statements too literally ever, because words can only be a kind of metaphorical approximation. Okay, now, do you see what this all adds up to? Because if you see it, it's profoundly liberating, right? I touched on this in prior videos, but here I wanted to try to explain it with some different language, right? And from citing biology. And in some earlier videos, I was citing more physics, and I was, trying to explain, poorly as it turned out, the concept of the block universe, and how that means that everything has in fact already happened. And some YouTube viewers decided to take issue with that, and in fact they were arguing with my inadequate representation of what leading theoretical physicists actually say about the issue. So better that I try to explain it in another way. But for those who are interested, if you read Brian Greene's book, The Fabric of the Cosmos, you'll find the explanation there is everything I said it was and more, meaning my representation wasn't perfect, but the conclusions that Brian Greene comes to are even stronger than the ones that I proposed in these preceding videos. But the point here is that you can come at this issue from multiple different angles, right? And if you really drill down on it, you're going to become free of guilt and shame forever, because you could not have acted differently than as you did. And if you could not have, I hope it hardly needs to be said that it's not true that you should have acted differently, because you couldn't have, right? So some people say, but what about randomness? Couldn't randomness be a part of all this? Absolutely, right? There's quantum mechanics shows us that not everything is completely determined. There's an element of randomness or unpredictability in the system, okay? But that doesn't change any of this, because things being, 98% determined by the causal matrix and 2% random, if that's the, correct proportions, still that doesn't mean that you could have done anything differently, because the randomness is literally random. You see what I mean? Okay. So, some critics, by the way, think I got this argument from Sam Harris and say, oh, you shouldn't be taking your cues from him. No. This is exactly what I already found to be true through the study of tantric philosophy and my reflection on the nature of reality through direct experience. And that's, Sam Harris is just one of the people who confirmed it and corroborated it from a different angle. Okay, so let's come to the conclusion. There's a pattern of existence, right? In Tantra, we sometimes call it paravak, the supreme word, where the supreme word is actually means something like logos in the Greek system. And indeed, the word logos in Greek gets translated as word in, for example, the Gospel of John. I'm not taking that as an authority, by the way, as a reference point at all. But I'm just giving an example. In the Gospel of John, it famously says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the word being translated as word there is logos, that book, that text being written, of course, originally in Greek. So in the same sense then, right, because logos really, word is perhaps a bad translation. It really means something like the deep structure of reality, the pattern of reality, and the intelligence of that pattern, the fact that the pattern is so precisely calibrated, the fact that that pattern has an innate intelligence of a kind that makes it as finely and beautifully ordered and patterned as it is. Okay, you could call that a theological assertion. It doesn't matter. The point is that the pattern is one and the same with what I was calling the causal matrix. And the pattern, therefore, is what causes everything to happen in precisely the way that it does. The cause of every one thing that happens is everything else that has ever happened, right? And so if you give that theological language, you say, whether you call it Shiva or the goddess, there is only one agent of all actions, right? Worshippers of the goddess in this tantric tradition say it that way, that everything is her will and everything happens only by her will, right? But in a non-dual context, this obviously cannot mean a supernatural, superhuman person sitting on top of, the structure of the cosmos, directing things, but according to her whim. That's nothing but the projection of the baser aspects of our humanity onto an imagined superhuman person, right? So that's not what it means, at least in a non-dual context, when a tantrika says everything happens by her will, right? It means that everything is part of the same pattern. There's nothing outside of that pattern, at least nothing knowable and observable and verifiable. And you yourself are a product of the pattern, right? You are the pattern in a particular configuration. And if you're the pattern, you can't, you're every choice you make is a part of that pattern, right? And the cause of what you choose, that is to say, the cause of something appearing like the right choice to you, is everything that's ever happened in your life and your ancestors' lives and the whole history of everything. And it couldn't have been different, right? Now, the next choice that you make could be dissimilar to past choices you have made because you have learned new things, and that's fine, right? Because this philosophy is not condemning you to repeat all your past actions and choices. Of course not. That would be bonkers, right? You learn, and therefore different choices become available to you, right? But it's still the same phenomenon, the same patterned phenomenon, whereby all these factors come into play, and when they all sum to 100, right? When they narrow the field of possibilities down to 1, then that choice gets made, and we again feel or imagine, here I am choosing. So the real problem at the root of this is actually the sense of I, right? The problem, meaning to say that which generates the illusion here, doesn't have to do with will. It has to do with the feeling of I, the feeling of being a separate self. Now, if that can be seen to be nothing but a cognitive illusion, a kind of mirage, like thinking there's water in the desert when there isn't, right? Then this whole issue, evaporates, and you do become permanently free of all guilt and shame, and for that matter, anxiety, social anxiety, worrying about what people think, or about how you come off, what your autobiography, countless things, countless issues, countless sources of suffering evaporate when the I, meaning the sense of separate self, independent separate self, is seen to be an illusion. And that's just as much a part of tantric philosophy as it is part of Buddhism. But a lot of people don't realize that, because the language of self is often used in tantric philosophy, but not in the sense of individual self, more in the sense of the one, right? And you see this in the Recognition Sutras, for example. Kshemarajya uses the term the self, sort of capital S self, if you will, as a term that means the one, or if you want to call it God, or the one infinite intelligence or divine consciousness, right? But seeing the illusory nature of separate individuality is just as much a part of Shaiva tantric philosophy as Buddhist. Okay, so I recommend it most heartily. And I hope this contemplation helps you as it's helped me to become free of these states of mind-created suffering. Om.